Survival movies and survival shows often depict incredible stories of perseverance, but few rival the remarkable true account of Captain Thomas Musgrave. Musgrave, a baptized member of the Wesleyan Methodist Church in Kendal, England, demonstrated remarkable faith throughout his journey. Hi, and welcome to Old Time Preaching. My name is Tim. Last name? Well, I'm a nobody, so why does it matter? Just call me the chief of the Nobodies. Anyway, this site, podcast, YouTube channel, whatever medium I use, is not about me. It's about giving glory to God and His Son, Jesus Christ. I don't ask for anything in return because I'm a slave to Christ, or, as the scriptures say, a doulos, slave. So I work not for payment or recognition, but solely to bring glory to my Master. That being said, I have a real treat for those who love survival shows or stories of faith and endurance. This time, we're diving into an incredible survival story that combines both faith and grit. If you've ever been fascinated by shipwreck islands or real-life hardships that test the human spirit, you'll love this. Found in Castaway on the Auckland Isles, a narrative of the wreck of the Grafton by Captain Thomas Musgrave. This book recounts how Musgrave and his crew endured being stranded on a desolate shipwreck island in the middle of nowhere. What makes this story even more compelling is how faith and leadership played a pivotal role in their survival. Musgrave's final voyage as a ship's captain began on November 12, 1863, departing from Sydney on a prospecting and sealing expedition to Campbell Island and the Auckland Islands, located south of New Zealand. Tragically, the journey took a dire turn when the ship was wrecked in Carnley Harbour, Auckland Island, in early January 1864. Stranded with a crew of 5, Musgrave and his companions faced incredible challenges. Over time, they managed to refashion the ship's dinghy, and in July 1865, Musgrave and 2 others undertook a daring 400-kilometer voyage to Stewart Island to seek rescue. Musgrave later chronicled their harrowing ordeal in his memoir Castaway on the Auckland Isles, offering a gripping account of survival and resilience. Now, let's pause for a moment. Can you imagine today's Methodists in a similar situation? Between debating which bathroom to use or rallying for gender-neutral shipwreck shelters, they'd be too busy to survive a day, let alone lead a crew to safety. Faced with brutal conditions, Musgrave relied on faith and unshakable determination to lead his crew through trials that tested both body and spirit. For enthusiasts of survival movies, Musgrave's journey offers more than just a popcorn-worthy tale of endurance. It's like the Methodist version of Die Hard, with extra prayer and no Bruce Willis. The story kicks off in Melbourne, Australia, where Musgrave and his crew set sail on what was supposed to be a straightforward voyage. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. For history buffs seeking things to do in Melbourne, the city's maritime museums offer a treasure trove of seafaring tales, because nothing says relatable like imagining yourself on a leaky boat while clutching a Bible and trying not to freeze to death. Stranded on their shipwreck island, the crew faced uncertainty that could make even the toughest survival movies look like a picnic in the park. But Captain Musgrave didn't just bring them hope, he brought them church. Every Sunday, with the flair of a pastor and the grit of a ship captain, he made sure Scripture was read, raising spirits and anchoring their hope. His faith-driven leadership didn't just save their lives, it turned their ordeal into a survival tale that leaves other historical accounts looking like lukewarm reruns of survival shows. Adding to the intrigue are the geographical ties to New Zealand. If you're pondering things to do in Auckland, New Zealand, why not stroll into the Auckland Museum and marvel at maritime exhibits that whisper, "Survival isn't just for the movies, folks." These displays don't just showcase history, they let you step into the storm-ridden shipwreck island days of Captain Musgrave, whose leadership under pressure makes modern survival shows look like summer camp. Musgrave's faith and discipline created a masterclass in overcoming adversity. For fans of survival movies or real-life adventure tales, his account doesn't just inspire, it practically shouts, "This is how it's done." This narrative delivers a compelling and Christ-centered perspective. Captain Musgrave's account isn't just about surviving a shipwreck. It's a powerful testimony of how trust in the Lord and unwavering hope can guide the human spirit through the stormiest of trials. I'm just reading Captain Thomas Musgrave's journal, but I do recommend a companion read, Island of the Lost, Shipwrecked at the Edge of the World. The author does an excellent job of modernizing Musgrave's story and adding another intriguing layer, a separate wreck on the same island at the same time. Amazingly, these two groups, unaware of each other, faced vastly different outcomes, one led by faith in God, the other by chaos and despair, seemingly guided by Satan himself. I'll include a link for you to explore that story as well. As for Captain Musgrave's journey, it's informative and straightforward. I didn't have to change much of his writing to share it with you. I had hoped to make it more engaging with sound effects or break it into chapters, but unfortunately, I just don't have that kind of time right now. So, the whole account is being uploaded in one go. That being said, may God bless you all as you listen and reflect on this powerful testimony of faith and resilience. Introductory. Few more interesting narratives of disasters at sea have ever been given to the world than the journals in which Captain Musgrave records the wreck of the Grafton. A great trial, bravely met and gallantly surmounted, is therein told with a care and exactness, which is at the same time singularly modest. Remembering the difficulties with which the devoted little party was surrounded, what reader can fail to exclaim, in the words which I have quoted on the title page, "How shall I admire your heroic courage, ye marine worthies, beyond all names of worthiness? Indeed, the story of the wreck of the Grafton and of the sufferings of her crew would have found a very appropriate resting place in the pages of that famous history of voyages, traffiques, and discoveries, side by side with many another pitiful tale of shipwreck collected by the worthy Richard Hakluyt, preacher, to be the delight in all ages of the schoolboy as well as the scholar. The same feeling we experience in reading of poor Wills, the hero of the expedition across Australia, waiting, like Mr. Micawber, for something to turn up, animates us as we read how the castaways on the Aucklands used to strain their eyes looking for that relief which never came. We think of the clink of Reynal's anvil far into the night, whilst he is engaged forming out of old iron the bolts and nails necessary to repair the crazy dinghy for a perilous voyage of 240 miles across a stormy ocean. Our admiration is compelled no less by the tinkering, tailoring, and cobbling ingenuity of the gallant French mate than by the moral suasion of the master, who employs himself in the evening in teaching his men how to read and write, and in compiling sailing directions for a little-known part of the globe, to be sealed up in a bottle for the benefit of future navigators of the seas. In his direst strait, this modern complete seaman finds comfort in some lines of Thomas Moore, and finally makes his last cast for death or freedom with a truly Nelsonic touch. Regarded as simply a marvelous tale of the sea, as a practical lesson of self-reliance, the story is sufficiently interesting, but it is no less an important contribution to hydrographical science. The limits of this small volume will not allow for the publication of a mass of barometrical and other observations collected by Captain Musgrave. These will be forwarded to the proper quarter, and we doubtless receive the credit which they deserve. It only remains to add a brief resume of the steps which have been taken by the Government of Victoria, in conjunction with New South Wales and Queensland, to examine and set at rest the question of whether there are at present any other unfortunates dragging out a miserable existence on the Auckland Islands. It will be seen from the journal of Captain Musgrave that when he returned to the islands to rescue the two seamen he had left behind, He and others on board the Flying Scud on the 23rd August, 1865, thought they saw smoke on the eastern coast at a point shown on the map, which, however, they were not able to explore. Subsequently, they found the body of a seaman at Port Ross, who had evidently died from starvation. A slate, which was found lying near him, seemed to have been written on, but the utmost ingenuity has failed to decipher the characters with any accuracy. On arriving in Melbourne, Captain Musgrave waited upon the Honourable J.G. Francis, Commissioner of Trade and Customs, and explained his reasons for thinking that there might be still other persons on the island. As several vessels which had sailed from Melbourne were known to be missing, Mr. Francis, with a promptitude which does him great honour, immediately called for tenders for a vessel to proceed to the Aucklands, and finding that delay might ensue in sending a sailing vessel, at once ordered the equipment of HMCSS Victoria, Captain Norman. The Victoria sailed on the 4th October, having Captain Musgrave on board as a passenger, who thus, for the second time, put aside all personal considerations to carry out what he deemed to be his duty, a self-denial which, considering he has not seen his family since November 1863, is worthy of our heartiest sympathy. The English mail arrived after the Victoria had left Melbourne, and by it we received intelligence that the ship Invercalled had been lost on the Aucklands on the 10th May, 1864, and that 3 of the survivors had been taken off by a Peruvian vessel on the 22nd May, 1865. In the appendix will be found all that has yet reached us of the particulars of the wreck of the Invercalled. J.J.S. Melbourne, 25th October, 1865. A short account of the Auckland Islands. Our first knowledge of this group of islands is due to the commercial enterprise of British merchants. They were discovered by Captain Abraham Bristow in the ship Ocean, a vessel belonging to the late Samuel Enderby, Esquires, during a whaling voyage, August 16, 1806. This was in his 3rd voyage round the world, and the following extract from his logbook, quoted by Sir James Ross, announces the discovery, moderate and clear. At daylight saw land, bearing west by compass, and extending to the north as far as NE by N, distant from the nearest part about 10 leagues. This island or islands, as being the first discoverer, I shall call Lord Aucklands, my friend through my father, and it is situated according to my observation at noon, in latitude 50 degrees 48½ minutes, and longitude 166 degrees 42 minutes east. At a distance I had of the sun and moon at 10:30 a.m. The land is of a moderate height, and from its appearance I have no doubt but it will afford a good harbor in the north end, and I stood up southerly in about the latitude of 50 degrees 21 minutes south, and its greatest extent is northwest and southeast direction. This place, I think, extends about 8 leagues, and its soil I am told at the time and the lumbered state of my ship did not allow me to examine it. Captain Bristow visited the islands the following year, 1807, in the Sarah, also belonging to the Messrs. Enderby, when he took formal possession of the group in the name of King George III, and from that time they were added to a pursuing country, the account by Captain Bristow. See for further Findlay's Pacific Directory, to whom no navigator of these seas should be unknown, though it is hoped the maps in the Melbourne exhibition will add to the slight amount that has been compiled as a whole in the Melbourne Public Library. Ian Musgrave's account to have since become quite extinct. The whaling season terminated during the subsequent years, being visited occasionally by vessels in search of seals and whales, former coming into the bays to calve during the months of April and May, and the latter consisting chiefly of sea lions. Among those who came after, in 1829, was Captain Morrell, an American navigator to whom, among other things, we owe the discovery of the deposits of guano at Icabo, and whose description of the part of Carnley's harbor is given presently. In the year 1840, the island was visited by the vessels of 3 nations, the English ships Erebus and Terror under Sir James Clark Ross and Captain Crozier, the French corvettes L'Astrolabe and L'Azalée under Dumont d'Urville, and the United States exploring expedition under Captain Charles Wilkes. From the narratives of these voyages, we have chiefly derived the subsequent particulars. The islands were without permanent inhabitants during all the periods of the above visits, but subsequently a body of New Zealanders, about 70 in number, came over from Chatham Island in a whale ship and were landed on the N.E., or Enderby Island. Bringing with them their warlike spirit, their quarrels soon led to an outbreak, and some fighting and loss of life ensued. They then divided into two separate bodies, under different chiefs, about 30 remaining in their original locality, 25 more going to the southward, the remainder maintaining separate independence. However, Major Potts Hansen has, reduced these desolate shores for many years prior to Captain Musgrave's visit. From the eminent services rendered to geographical science, and to further those commercial enterprises in which Messrs. Enderby for several generations had so largely engaged, the group was granted by the British government to Messrs. Charles George and Henry Enderby. As the formation of the Southern Whale Fishery Company, they undertook the establishment of their principal center of operations here. Accordingly, Mr. Charles Enderby, with an efficient staff of assistants, took possession of his domain in the early part of 1850, finding the New Zealanders, before mentioned, in possession of a part of the land. Their claims were soon adjusted, and they became good auxiliaries to the infant colony. This, then, is the brief history of this remote island. It promised to become a most conspicuous point in the wide world of waters, with every advantage of situation and the possession of numerous excellent harbors. There were many events at command for the relaxation of whale and other fisheries in these seas. It was not unreasonably thought that it must soon become the center of the trade, and that, too, of a very different character to almost every other part of the South Pacific. But in less than 2 years, the whole scheme of the great southern whale fishery fell through. It does not fall within our province to go into particulars, although the story is both curious and instructive. It is sufficient to say that the whole settlement was abandoned in 1852, and the business details became the source of prolonged legal difficulties. Though the group has been visited by the 4 principal navigators above mentioned, Morel describing a southern harbor, which he calls Carnley's Harbor, and the 3 others all having confined their remarks to the northern or Laurie Harbor, we look for an imperfect notion of the entire group, even as regards its dimensions, until the recent visit of Captain Musgrave. From the cursory examinations made by Mr. Enderby, it would appear that the island must be considerably broader than is represented on d'Urville's chart. Of course, the very imperfect sketch given by Bristow cannot be taken as giving a correct idea of the island. The following imperfect notices of the group are collected from the narrative of the Voyage of Discovery, etc., of HMS Erebus and Terror, Volume 1, the narrative of the United States Exploring Expedition, Volume 1, Le Voyage de l'Astrolabe et l'Azalée, by M. Dumont d'Urville, and the narrative of 4 voyages by B. Morel. These sources have been also combined in a brochure by C. Enderby, Esquernes, F.R.S., a short account of the Auckland Islands, etc., London, 1849, and see also the Quarterly Review for June, 1847. Mr. McCormick, the naturalist to Sir James Ross's Antarctic expedition, remarks that the formation of the Auckland Islands, as well as Campbell Islands, is volcanic and constituted chiefly of basalt and green sand. He also calls attention to Dias Head in Laurie Harbor and to the Searles Island as being of great geological interest, exhibiting cliffs of basalt 300 feet high, which are highly magnetic. The loftiest hill, Mount Eden, at the head of Laurie Harbor, attains an elevation of 1,325 feet, is rounded at the top, and clothed with grass to its summit. Another hill on the west rises to nearly 1,000 feet. Footnote: Dr. Hooker, whose observations have been published in connection with the botany of the Erebus and Terror in the third volume of the Flora Antarctica, remarks that perhaps no place in the course of our voyage so abounded in the Southern Ocean productions of animal and vegetable life as did the Auckland Islands. Situated in nearly 51 degrees latitude and in the midst of a boisterous sea, they are swept by violent winds and covered with copious rains, which render them singularly adapted to the preservation of an abundant and vigorous flora. Many new species of peculiar interest were observed. Possessing no mountains rising into the limits of perpetual snow, and few rocks or precipices, the whole land seemed covered with vegetation. A low forest skirts all the shores, succeeded by a broad belt of brushwood, above which, to the summit of the hills, extend grassy slopes. On a closer inspection, the forest is found to be composed of a dense thicket of stag-headed trees, so gnarled and stunted by the violence of the gales as to afford an excellent shelter for a luxuriant undergrowth of bright green feathery ferns and several gay-flowered herbs. Yet it is not without regret that we notice the almost entire absence of those trees or shrubs to which the voyager has been accustomed in the north, and one cannot help feeling how much greater the pleasure would be to come across new kinds of pine, birch, willow, or the oak, than those remarkable trees that have no allies in the northern hemisphere, and the mention of which, suggesting no familiar form to compare them with at home, can interest few but the professed botanist. 80 flowering plants were found, a small number, but consisting of species more remarkable for their beauty and novelty than the flora of any other country can show, no less than 56 being hitherto undescribed, and one half of the whole peculiar to this group, as far as it is at present known. The trees on the island have been stated by some as rising to 70 feet in height, by others only to 30 feet. Captain Musgrave gives the latter. Both may be right, for the age is most generally found to have been overturned by the strong gales, which is readily done from the nature of the soil they grow in, a very deep, light, peaty earth, which affords but little support for the roots. From the above-mentioned cause, the stems are seldom straight enough to afford timber of any magnitude. For fences, or such purposes, it may be very valuable. Abundance of fuel for this source, then, may be relied on. The peat, too, which covers the greater portion of the island, might be made available for this purpose, not perfectly so, by the usual mode adopted in Ireland. Water, as an article of consumption, is very abundant. The stream which falls into the head of Laurie Harbor had sufficient water to form a noble cataract after a month's dry weather, and indeed abundance of streams are to be met with in all parts. The nature of the soil is such that whatever quantity of rain falls, it is very quickly sunk below the surface, and then, probably, percolates away to the volcanic and impervious rock beneath. From the moist climate and the spongy, porous character of the soil, this peaty formation arises. This vegetable formation is found to be several feet in thickness and contains a mass of decomposed black vegetable fiber, which, if properly compressed, makes good fuel. Great difficulty was experienced in forming a foundation for the observatory. By the time the Erebus and Terror's visits, it is hoped that they will effect sufficient depth in the peat to gain the solid rock on which to fix their instruments. The magnetic observations made here were found to be singularly affected by the nature of the island. Some of the magnets were found entirely to depend for their direction on the north and south poles on the fragments of rocks around them. The compass in the Terror was so much affected by Shoe Island as to mask the local attraction of the iron in the ship. These phenomena led to the opinion that the island may be taken as one great magnetic field. Respecting the zoology of these islands, Mr. McCormick observes, There is no species of land animal, with the exception of the domestic pig, introduced several years ago in the island by Captain Bristow. Their food consists of the Anatifera polaris, described by Dr. Hooker as one of the most beautiful and singular of the vegetable productions of the island it inhabits, growing in large orbicular masses on rocks and banks near the sea, or amongst the dense and gloomy vegetation of the woods. Its copious bright green foliage and large umbels of waxy flowers have a most striking appearance. The whole plant, he adds, has a heavy and rather disagreeable smell, common to many of its natural order, but it is nevertheless greedily eaten by goats, pigs, and rabbits. It is so abundant in marshy spots that these animals frequently live entirely amongst it, particularly where it grows upon the margins of the woods, where they form broad tracks through the patches, grubbing up the roots to a great extent, and by trampling down the soft, damp leaves and stems, make soft and warm layers, considerable in extent. One of these animals was shot by Mr. Hallett, and although in poor condition, its flesh was considered well flavored, though by no means equal to that of our own wild pigs. Glory Harbor and the round part of the island are thus described in the narrative of the United States exploring expedition in the ship Porpoise, dated 7th March, 1840. On the 7th, we anchored in the harbor of Sarah's bosom in 12 fathom water. During our brief stay here, all were actively employed, working and watering, for the island affords a rich supply of opportunity. Assistant Surgeon Holmes made several excursions in the larger island, of which he gives the following account. I found it very thickly wooded in several parts, with beautiful vegetation. As few of them were of any size, I found no small difficulty in penetrating and making my way through them. In many places it was absolutely impassable. It was only after a long and fatiguing walk that I succeeded in reaching the summit of that part of the island which the brig anchored near, when I found that the trees became rare. A thick growth of underwood and dwarf bushes, intermingled with ferns, concealed the surface, rendering it difficult to walk. Even in places apparently void of trees, the ground was very unequal, and a single step would sometimes send me nearly up to the neck into a hollow filled with large fern fronds. On the highest parts, the small level spots were covered only with moss and a description of tall grass, and in places also a kind of grain grew abundantly. But in the spots generally surveyed, all the water being found in the streams, which were numerous and pure. Near the summit, the ground was perforated in all directions, probably by birds who rear their young in these holes. Many of the birds, principally Procellaria, were sitting on the ground. They made an effort to escape, but suffered themselves to be taken without any attempt at resistance. The forest was full of small birds of 3 or 4 different species, which were perfectly fearless. One little fellow alighted on my cap as I was sitting under a tree, and sang long and melodiously. Another, and still smaller species, of a black color, spotted with yellow, was numerous, and sang very sweetly. Its notes were varied, but approximated more nearly to the song of our blackbird. Occasionally, a note or two resembled the lark's. Hawks, too, are numerous, and might be seen in almost all the clear spaces in pairs. Along the sea coast were to be seen the tracks of their ravages upon the smaller birds. The seabirds were very numerous on the opposite side of the island, sitting upon the cliffs or hovering over the sea. On the western side of the Auckland Island, the albatross and young trees are exceedingly thick. Dr. Holmes remarks that he was occupied fully an hour in making his way for 100 yards, where no trail appeared, in a location he had never before trodden. There was not a vestige of a track. Old trees were strewn about irregularly, sometimes kept erect by the dense brush and ferns. Some trees were seen upwards of 70 feet in height, although they were generally from 15 to 30. Every part of the island was decayed volcanic matter, had acquired considerable richness, and specimens of wild plants were collected. Some resembling the principal plants were found here. These were believed in many places to be the appearance of having been directly from the ice. This island has clearly been inhabited since the month of April and May. Near the village was a commodious hut has been erected, and a tree shivered. A fresh pier was another made near inland, close to the grave of a presbytery member. A stone-built kiln and a wooden cross erected over it. Some attempts at forming a garden were observed at one of the points of Sarah's bosom, and turnips, cabbages, and potatoes were growing finely, which, if left undisturbed, will add to the natural production of the island, as there was one visitor who added. Many of the small islands in this group were visited. They closely resemble the larger ones. The cliffs consist of basalt and are generally from 50 to 60 feet perpendicular. These islands are picturesque, wild, steep, and basaltic in appearance. The highest peak was estimated to be 800 feet. The smallest has less elevation. The general aspect of the land resembles the region round Cape Egmont. Climate. No very accurate knowledge of the general climate of the group is as yet acquired, though the full and exact observations made by Captain Musgrave during his 20-month stay are valuable on this head. It has been supposed to be similar to Chiloe, but in one particular, the climate differs from that of Chiloe, viz., the strong winds to which it would appear the islands are subject to. The trees are evidence of this, as they bend from the general westerly direction of the violent squalls. Mr. Enderby experienced one very remarkable phenomenon in the early part of 1850 at the station in Port Ross. A most violent gust of wind struck with the force of a solid body the spot near where he was, and this not for any continued period or over an extended space, but only for about 5 seconds of time and a few yards in diameter. After passing outward, the procession of the repeated shocks could be heard as short intervals as it went. There was no apparent cause for it, and the intervening spaces were comparatively calm. This would form an important consideration with vessels unprepared for such a visitation when at anchor. The Auckland group, according to Sir James Ross, consists of one large and several smaller islands, separated by narrow channels. The largest island is stated to be about 30 miles long and 15 broad in extreme breadth, but this cannot be considered as exact. It contains 2 harbors, 2 principal harbors, whose entrances are both from the west, and whose heads or termination reach within 2 or 3 miles of the western coast. Laurie Harbor is at the northeastern island of the group. It forms the northern side of the channel leading into Port Ross. It was upon this island that the principal portion of the stock landed by the Whale Fishery Company was kept. Here was also situated one of the principal harbors, protected as it was at its entrance by several small islets, and surrounded by hills that gave it a wild yet partly wooded appearance in bold relief. The New Zealanders, who were established here, remain indifferent, while the vegetation has been noticed for being of unusual quality, existing only in patches, the latter equal to any European. This suggests well that other fruits and plants may flourish. The island is not high, and water supplied with water. There is a narrow entrance to Laurie Harbor, between the end of Enderby Island and Rose Island, which is only a channel fit for boats. The sea was breaking right across the opening when the Erebus passed, but in calm weather it might be mistaken by strangers for a safe passage. As is frequently the case, the tidal currents meet off Enderby Island, and from the Sir James Ross says, "On rounding the northeast cape of Enderby Island, we passed through some strong whirlpools occasioned by the meeting of the tides off the point, and although we did not at first find soundings with our ordinary hand lines, it is by no means improbable that some shoals or rocky patches may have some influence in producing these strong and dangerous eddies." Laurie Harbor, or Port Ross. Captain Bristow, the discoverer of these islands, who also drew the first sketch of the group, named this the principal harbor, Laurie Harbor, after the gentleman who first issued this knowledge to the world in 1810. On a chart of the Western Pacific by Captain Purdy and published by Mr. Laurie, this sketch will be found. A copy of this chart by the late Mr. Purdy, presented to Captain Hurd, R.N., was published by the Admiralty in 1823, and these composed our entire knowledge of them until the visits of Captain Sir James Ross and Admiral D. Irville. D'Urville has given a rough survey of them, and Captain Sir James Ross has given a survey of the harbor in question, under the name of Enderby Harbor. But following the recognized principle, we have retained the name applied by its discoverer in 1806. Mr. Enderby has given a third appellation, that of Port Ross, which, as it has been in use, we have also retained. For the first complete survey of the harbor, we owe a great obligation to Sir James Ross. There are two surveys of this excellent harbor, the one by Sir James Ross, the other by Admiral D'Urville. That of the latter is the most complete and exhibits more in detail the character of the locality. The entrance to the harbor lies between Enderby Island on the north, of which one coast is a pilot station, and Green Island, a low island off Sir James Ross, their distance apart being little more than a mile, whereas Island is 3/4 of a mile west of Green Island and is connected by shoal water to the S.E. point of the harbor. Rose Island, which forms a continuation of the northeastern side, overlooks the N.W. of Ocean Island. The distance between the Cape Harbor runs 2.5 miles to the S.W., having a depth of 10 to 30 fathoms, and the shores bold to land. Shoal Island, in the middle of the harbor, and 3/4 of a mile south, Cape, Mount Eden. Terror Cove is to the west of this, and is separated from Erebus Cove to the south by a small projecting point of land. Sir James Ross's observatory was in Terror Cove. In the former chart, this is called the Harbor of Sarah's Bosom, but being thus named by Captain Bristow when he came to its shore in 1807. He anchored here in the Sarah, hence its appellation. In his brief account he states that ships may be safely landlocked all around. Here may be had plenty of fine water, wood in the greatest abundance, winged game, etc. The islands are annoyed by the most powerful gales in winter. The result of the observations made by Sir James C. Ross at Sarah Harbor, or Terror Cove, gave for the observatory latitude 50 degrees 32 minutes 30 seconds south, longitude 166 degrees 13 minutes 34 seconds east, variation 17 degrees 40 minutes east, dip 73 degrees 12 minutes, high water full and change at 12 hours. The highest spring tides scarcely exceed 3 feet. A remarkable oscillation of the tide when near the time of high water was observed. After rising to nearly its highest, the tide would fall 2 or 3 inches and then rise again between 3 and 4 inches, so as to exceed its former height, rather more than an inch. This irregular movement generally occupied more than an hour, of which the fall continued about 20 minutes and the rise 50 minutes of the interval. The establishment of the Southern Whale Fishery Company was fixed at the south side of Erebus Cove. This shore is bounded on the south side by a small peninsula projecting in an E&E direction and connected by a narrow isthmus. This cove allows easy landing, and the land being level is suitable for the purposes of wharfages, whaling stores, etc. From this part of the land to the harbor extends nearly 5 miles farther in a WSW direction to its head, into which a fine and copious stream of fresh water falls. In its upper part, Mr. Enderby found the area valuable beds of cockles and oysters. The southern side of the harbor does not require any particular note. The following is Sir James Ross's account of the harbor. Enderby's harbor, which is at the northern extreme of the island, contains several secure anchorages. The contour of these, it is well protected from all winds except those from the SE, and the holding ground is a good tenacious clay. It is probable that there may be found good anchorage also to the west of Enderby Island. After passing Ocean and Rose Islands, a ship may anchor in perfectly safety in any part, but the most convenient will be found to be between these islands and Erebus Cove, where abundance of wood and water may be obtained, as also at Terror Cove. The upper end of the inlet, called Laurie Harbor, is the most suitable for ships waiting to heave down or to undergo any extensive repairs. It is perfectly landlocked, and the steep beach on the southern shore affords the greatest facility for clearing and reloading the vessel. I was so struck with the many advantages this place possesses for a penal settlement over every other I had heard named, to which to remove convicts from the now free colonies of New South Wales, New Zealand, and Van Diemen's Land, that I addressed a letter on the subject to Sir John Franklin on my return to Hobart Town, recommending its adoption. This letter was forwarded to the Secretary of State for the Colonies, but I believe Chatham Island, as being seated in a milder climate, has been preferred, although I am not aware of any other advantage it possesses, whilst the want of good harbors will be found a great drawback, and the 2 tribes of New Zealanders from Fort Nicholson, who took possession of it in 1850-1835, after eating the men and the aborigines they found there, and making slaves of the other half, will prove a difficult people to dispossess of the land they have gained by conquest. Laurie Harbor is well calculated for the formation of an establishment for the prosecution of the whale fishery. Many black and several sperm whales came into the harbor whilst we were there, and from such a situation the fishery might be pursued with very great advantage. We arrived there in the spring of the year, November being equivalent in climate to the month of May in England. There is a great difference in the temperature, amounting to about 10 degrees of the Fahrenheit scale, between the temperature of the air and that of the water, yet at the same time the temperature of the atmosphere during the day is the same in both places. It cannot, however, be considered as a healthy place, as we found the temperature even in the middle of summer varying as much as 20 degrees in 12 hours. The latitude is the same latitude, and the mean temperature for April, the equivalent to November, is 47 degrees. At the Auckland Islands, says Ross, the average temperature was 45 degrees Fahrenheit. As several notices of the islands during a fog, and had some difficulty in rounding to the northernward, as we opened the harbor, the squalls came down the western hills with much violence, threatening to blow us out to sea again, and it required the utmost vigilance and activity of the officers and crew in beating up the inlet to maintain the ground we had gained. There is, however, ample space, and no concealed dangers. The best seaweed which grows along the shore and rocks point out the shallow or dangerous parts. After 5 hours of hard contending with the fierce westerly gales, we anchored at 1 p.m., November 20th, 1840, in a small cove on the west shore in 10 fathoms. Captain Wilkes says, "The harbor of Sarah's Bosom is not the most secure. That of Laurie is protected from all winds and has a large and fine streamlet of water at its head. The rocks are covered with limpets, and small fish of many varieties are caught in quantities among the kelp. The crew enjoyed themselves on the shores and fires. No geese were seen, and the only game observed were a few gray ducks, snipe, cormorants, and the common shag. The land birds are excellent eating, especially the hawks. On the whole, it is a very desirable place in which to refit." Some officers of the French expedition, under Admiral d'Urville, made a boat excursion to Laurie Harbor. They thus speak of this part of the east coast lying between the 2 harbors. "The banks are very full of fish. The bottom is regular, varying from 15 to 20 fathoms. The coast is indented with numerous creeks, surrounded by basaltic rocks, where boats can easily approach. If ever, says M. Dubouzet, one of the French officers, in his journal, the fine harbors of these islands should attract colonization, Lorry Harbor would be the most suitable point for the formation of a town. Another, M. Jacquinot says, the vast bay is encircled everywhere by the mural cliffs, which rise from the surface of the water. The shell of volcanic formation is covered with thick layers of vegetable soil, producing a vigorous growth of ferns. The eastern side of the island is but little known as yet. From what has been ascertained of its value, the northern side is preferable, as a fact confirmed by the visits of the native whalers to Lorry Harbor. The weather on the eastern side is most likely bad, judging from the storms. These notes are enough to show the worth of the Auckland group for scientific, practical, and fishing purposes. Adam Island appears on Bristow's chart, and to the northward of it is seen the Carnley's harbor of Captain Morrell, the Sarah's bosom of Captain Musgrave. Carnley's harbor makes in about 4 miles to the eastward of the South Cape, and the entrance is formed by 2 bluff points, from which, to the head of the lagoon, the distance is 15 miles. The passage is above 2 miles wide and entirely free from danger, with 25 fathoms of water in mid-channel. It turns at first NNW, then NNE, forming at the head of the lagoon a beautiful basin, with sufficient room for half-dozen ships to moor. The least water from the entrance, until we came near the anchorage, was 25 fathoms mid-channel. We anchored in 4 fathoms good ground. 1. The western side of this island is a perpendicular, bluff, iron-bound coast, with deep water within 100 fathoms of the shore, while the eastern coast is principally lined with a pebbly or sandy beach, behind which are extensive level plains covered with beautiful grass and refreshing herbage, extending back about 5 miles and then rising into elevated hills. All the hills, except a few of the highest, are thickly covered with lofty trees, flourishing with such extraordinary vigor as to afford a magnificent prospect for the spectator. If the large trees are principally of 2 sorts, one of them is of the size of our large firs, and grows nearly in the same manner. Its foliage is an excellent substitute for spruce in making that pleasant and wholesome beverage, spruce beer. The other resembles our maple, and often grows to a great size, but is only fit for shipbuilding or fuel, being too heavy for masts or spars of any dimensions. The quality of the soil in this island is sufficiently indicated by the immense luxuriance of all its productions. Were the forest cleared away, very few spots would be found that could not be converted to excellent pasturage or tillage land. The valleys, plains, hillsides, and every spot where the rays of the sun penetrate are now clothed with a strong, heavy, luxuriant grass, interspersed with many natural specimens of the countless beauties of nature's vegetable kingdom. This extraordinary length of vegetation is no doubt greatly assisted by the agreeable temperature of the climate, which is very fine. The climate is mild, temperate, and salubrious. It has been found to yield to the first respectability and talent who have visited the island in the month of July, the dead of winter in this island, corresponding to our January, that the weather was as respects cold, as the mercury was never lower than 38 degrees in the valleys, and the trees at the same time retained their verdure as if it was midsummer. I have no doubt but that the foliage of many of the trees would prevail and die in the following spring by the new crop of buds and leaves. At the time we were there, the mercury seldom rose higher than 78 degrees, although it answered to our July. The weather is generally good at all seasons of the year, notwithstanding there are occasional high winds attended with heavy rains. The western side of the island, according to Captain Bristow, is very high and precipitous, and may be seen in clear weather 16 or 17 leagues off. Towards the northern part are 2 remarkable natural pyramids or columns called the Column Rocks. The NW Cape is a very perpendicular headland, with a rocky islet and a curious conical rock just off it. Just to the east of it is a dark-looking promontory called Blackhead, with a deep, cavernous indentation at its base. This was afterwards found to be only a short distance from the westernmost point of Lorry Harbor. It was reached by Mr. McCormick and some other officers from the Erebus and Terror by following the stream, which empties itself into the head of the harbor and whose source is in the hills above Black Head. These hills are from 800 to 900 feet high. Disappointment Island lies off the western side of the island and is shown on Bristow's chart. Bristow Rock, which must be very dangerous, is also given from the same author as lying 8 miles north of Enderby Island and is just seen when water's edge. It was not seen by Sir James Ross and therefore requires great caution. Campbell Island. This island was discovered by Captain Fred Hasselberg of the brig Perseverance, belonging to Mr. Robert Campbell of Sydney in 1810. According to its account, the island is 30 miles long and 15 broad, and the southern portion has here been armed with harbors, of which 2 on the east side are to be preferred. The southernmost of these 2 he named Perseverance Harbor, and the other Sir James Ross anchored in Erebus and Terror, December 1840. The highest hill seen from the harbor is on its north side, and has an elevation of 1,500 feet. The eastern side of the island, and its strongly sheltered harbor, have also been described. The hills, from being wooded, have a more cheerful aspect than the neighboring Auckland Islands, and the climate is proportionately milder. The sheltered places, the abundance of timber and water, and the safety of the harbors give this site great prospective position to the prevailing course of exploration. Perseverance. Harbor is about 4 miles in depth, running for more than 2 miles in a WNW direction, and thence, after passing a shoal point, with a warning bed of seaweed off it, on which the Terror grounded, about WSW to its head. In the outer part of the harbor the water is too deep for convenient anchorage, but in the upper part, which is completely landlocked, there is abundant room for 100 ships to lie in the most perfect security, and excellent water can be had in any quantity. The remains of some huts were found on each side of a cove to the north of the Erebus's anchorage, as also the graves of several seamen, and one of a French woman accidentally drowned. There had been an establishment at the side of a stream in the northwest corner of the harbor, but the position was not so good as that of the cove. The observations on the beach, near the shoal point, was found to be in latitude 50 degrees 33 minutes 6 seconds south, longitude 166 degrees 9 minutes 41 seconds east, variation 17 degrees 54 minutes east, magnetic dip 73 degrees 53 minutes, high water, full and change, at 12 hours, but presenting the same irregularities as at Lorry Harbor, Auckland Isles. The rise and fall at Neeps was 43 inches. Narrative of the wreck of the schooner. Grafton, from the Private Journal of Captain Thomas Musgrave, Wednesday, December 30th, 1863. Commences with fresh breeze and dark, cloudy weather. At 6 p.m. made the Auckland group, bearing northwest, about 25 miles distant. Midnight, same weather. All sails set. Water smooth under the lee of the island. Barometer, 29.80. 2 a.m. Tack to SW. From this time till 6 a.m., weather moderately clear, but wind very puffy and treacherous. Took in foretop sail and all sail. The latter part, breeze unsettled, weather threatening, with a very ugly sea getting up. Noon, barometer, 29.55, falling rapidly. Every appearance of any gale, very heavy confused sea rising. South Cape of Auckland Islands, bearing west by south, distant 30 miles. I think it is Mr. Hazard's mistake. Latitude since we left Campbell's Island. Winds 2 p.m. SW, 4 p.m. West, 6 p.m. N by N, 10 p.m. NW by W, and 11 a.m. WNW 8 a.m. COM. Thursday, December 31st, 1863. Directly after the sea crossed the meridian, it came on to blow a gale. Immediately reduced sail to close reefed mainsail and foretopsail, tremendous sea and confused, breaking heavily on board in all directions, and the night dark as pitch. The motion of the vessel became very heavy, causing her to labor and strain heavily, and make a little water. Mr. Raynal, who had been mate of the Grafton, was also seriously ill during this time, while the schooner lay at Campbell's Island, which increased the difficulty of navigating the vessel. So I was all set to upload the entire book in one go, but after doing a bit of research, it turns out that's not exactly podcast friendly. Who knew? So instead of hitting you with an audiobook marathon, I'll be breaking it up into bite-sized, hour-long episodes. You're welcome.